10 years in 45 minutes. I'm here to give you a taste of the next decade, and I have been thinking about this a long time. And this forecast of the next 10 years is the most frightening 10-year forecast I've ever done. And I've been saying that for the last 5 years. But it's also the most hopeful. So it's like the stakes are up. So in these 45 minutes, what I'm going to try to do is take you down into the pits of despair and then pull you up and empower you, because your role, human resources, your role has the opportunity to make a better future. So this book is my attempt to look 10 years out and ask, what kind of leadership will it take to thrive, not just to survive? The VUCA world. I happened to be at the Army War College for the first time the week before 9/11. I am not a military guy. This is in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And when I went there, I was lectured to, I was briefed with a group of CEOs and senior partners from Deloitte. I was briefed about the future. And afterwards, I respectfully said, we could have learned a little more from each other, that in fact, business people have something to offer and military people too. And then, of course, 9/11 happened. And this sleepy liberal arts college that just happened to study warfare, this little college in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, renamed itself and called itself informally, as it still does, VUCA University, for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. These are pictures of Special Forces officers riding in Afghanistan right after 9/11, one of the few truly successful missions there that's been made into a movie now. And this experience changed my life, and I was asked to come back and facilitate a series of exchanges. I've done 15 of them now, with CEOs and with senior executives, to learn from the military and to learn from business and to draw out lessons for leadership, lessons for learning, lessons for strategy. And I'm going to share some of those with you very quickly. I'm under what they call the non-attribution policy, so I can explain what I learned, and indeed a lot of the ideas are in the book, but I can't attribute it without checking. So I'm going to give you that big picture view of where things are going. And the summary is, VUCA, over the next decade, is going to get much more VUCA. And here's how. It's going to require the theme of this conference. It's going to require navigating the future. I love the word navigating, because it isn't predicting, it's navigating. There's fixed forces, there's rocks, there's streams, there's currents. And there's lots of choices, and that's what we're here to talk about. What are those choices? How to navigate the VUCA world. Hiding will get harder in this world. Hiding will get harder, but seeking will get easier. This is from the literature on nuclear proliferation. Hide and seek. Hiding will get harder. Seeking will get easier. It will be increasingly inexpensive to spread a lie. The latest research from MIT, the big data study of Twitter, has proven this. It will be increasingly expensive to correct a lie. So this is a given. It's one of these things that's obvious if you think 10 years ahead. Amy Chua described it best. I first met Amy. She's a political law professor at Yale. I first met her in Istanbul when I was speaking at a McKinsey Directors Conference. She was speaking around her previous book, The Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mom, and she has the ability to tackle these tough topics. So what she says in her new book, which is a signal of the future, is today every group feels attacked, pitted against each other, not just for jobs and spoils, but for the right to define the nation's identity. In these conditions, democracy devolves into pure political tribalism. That's the VUCA of today. The so what is our overarching identity, that ability that we've had as Americans to see what we have in common, what we choose to do together. The answer now is not much, not much. And in one of the reviews, they point out worsening social divisions are much easier to exploit than to explain or redress. So here's Amy talking about the new book, and just to give you a taste of this world of political tribes.
You think we've come to a new era in the United States where everybody is feeling tribal, whether you are a minority or in a majority or any of these things. You think everybody's feeling pressure right now.
Right. So tribalism it's hardwired in us, and we just can't ignore it. If we don't fight it, we are all tribal. The problem is when tribalism takes over the political system. That's much less healthy, and that's what we're seeing right now, because what happens is so many different groups feel threatened. Not just minorities, but whites feel threatened, not just Muslims and Jews and Buddhists, but Christians feel threatened. So when people feel threatened, that's when they retreat into tribalism and they get very insular and more defensive. And the problem, Becky, is when with tribalism, you see everything through your tribal lens, and you kind of ignore facts. You want to stick to your team and be loyal to it. And that's preventing us from having some really important national conversations.
This notion of tribalism, it's one thing to think your tribe is right about life. It's quite another to think everybody else, every other tribe is wrong. And that's the threshold we're crossing over the next decade. News for one tribe can be fake news for another. So the question always is, hasn't it always been a VUCA world? And the answer is yes, beginning from the fact we all have to die at an uncertain time. But what's new? What's new? And we've been doing 10-year forecasting now for 50 years, so we're the longest running futures think tank in the world. And what's new about this period is three things. One is global climate disruption, global scale climate disruption that we still haven't taken stock of. Now, we're not an advocacy group at Institute for the Future, but we study big disruptions like this. We started studying global climate disruption in 1977. And it's pretty obvious something bad is happening. It only depends on whose models you believe as to how bad it is. Secondly, cyber-enhanced terrorism, very worrisome on a global scale. And finally, with this frame, weaponized everyday objects, think things like pickup trucks. To last July, on July 19th, DARPA issued a request for proposals for gene drivers. Basically, synthetic biology that can be used to attack living organisms, possible to disrupt on a much larger scale with a much smaller effort. So these big three really worry me, but there's one looming sure thing forecast that is perhaps the most fearsome. It's the rich-poor gap. The rich-poor gap will be stark over the next decade. It's hard to do a 10-year forecast where the rich-poor gap gets better. It's easy to do a forecast where it gets worse. And the sure thing about this is it will be, the rich-poor gap will be increasingly visible. So I'm going to introduce you to a series of signals. William Gibson said it best, the future's already here, it's just unevenly distributed. So we call these signals, which are specific events, products, or books that bring the unevenly distributed future to life. So here's a couple signals about the rich-poor gap that really trouble me. This is my least favorite site on the internet. It's called Rich Kids of Instagram. These are young people all in their families' corporate jets flaunting their wealth. And what do the poor kids say? What do the poor kids say when they see these rich kids, these super rich kids, flaunting their wealth? And ask, why? Here's another one. This is outside of Topeka, Kansas. This is the world's most expensive condominium where you can live underground in a bunker if the apocalypse hits. And this is the doorman. That's a signal. That's a signal that there's some people so wealthy that they're preparing for the apocalypse, and they're preparing by hiding underground in Kansas. So the next decade, and here's the sure thing forecast, and now we're at the low point of this talk. I'm going to start pulling you up in a minute. The next decade will be characterized by a single word. The single word is scramble. Scramble. That's what we're in for. So as a human resource organization, you're going to have to figure out how to engage with the scramble. Many things that have been stuck will get unstuck in the scramble. Now, I'm a 10-year forecaster. I focus my life 10 years ahead. I am not an expert in the present. But I will tell you my take on the leaders in the present is they seem to be very good at unsticking things, but I doubt they're going to be very good at putting things back together again. So what I think is going to happen is there'll be an extreme number of unintended consequences. And that creates a ripe time for innovation. This is the good news. If you're ready to play, beyond the tribes of the present. If you get pulled into those polarities, those tribal polarities, you're stuck. But if you take the long view and look 10 years out, you've got a chance to change the world. And here's the big secret I'm going to share with you. 30 years of 10-year forecasting, here's the essence of what I've learned. And it's embodied in our logo, IFTF. This was designed on an Etch-a-Sketch, remember that? Original continuous line function. It says, it's really hard to read here, IFTF for Institute for the Future. But if you hold it back, the more you hold it back, the more clear it becomes. That's the essence of our brand story. That's the story of 10-year forecasting. It's easier to do a 10-year forecast than it is a 1 or 2 year forecast. So I'm always asked, how can you do a 10-year forecast? I can't even do a 1 or 2 year forecast. The reason is because it's easier. So that's the beginning of this literacy of thinking about the future but working back from it. And here's our methodology. Foresight, insight, action always begins with hindsight. The neuroscientists teach us that we all have this personal neural story net in our brains that tells us stories about past, present, and future. You're telling yourselves stories about the future, stories about me right now. And I'm trying to break in with foresight, which is a story from the future, plausible, internally consistent, provocative, with signals to bring them to life. And, you know, we're usually right. We've been doing this 50 years. 60 to 80% of our forecasted futures have actually happened. We call this futures thinking. It's designed to provoke your insight, an aha that creates a new pattern of connections in your brain. And once you've had an insight, you can't go back. That's the amazing thing about insight. Ideas are important, but they're much easier than insight. Design thinking fits right in here, so most of us in Institute for the Future are trained in design thinking too. They go together really well. Design thinking starts from the present and goes out and usually ethnographically looks at unmet user needs and wants. We leap 10 years out and work backwards. And the two meet in what we call custom forecasts, which is a lot of what I do in my practice now. This foresight through insight has to feed into strategy. Every good strategy is based on a compelling insight. And the way we get evaluated, the way foresight should be evaluated is, does the foresight lead to an insight that leads to a better decision in the present? So it's an agile way forward, expressed with clarity, and ideally as a story. So the military calls this commander's intent or mission command. Leaders are in the middle. So I hope what you all can learn out of this is to continuously cycle foresight, insight, action. Most of today's leaders are great in the present, and they kind of inch their way out to the future. That's a really dangerous, slow-moving way to lead in a VUCA world. It's much better to go 10 years out and work backwards. And finally, I remind you, nobody can predict the future. If somebody tells you they can predict the future, you shouldn't believe them, especially if they're from California. So the big idea I want to introduce to you today is what I call the 2010 threshold. And it's a great setup for talking about kids and about the young workers entering the workforce. But I have a very specific idea about this 2010 threshold. And it all started with the internet, which was conceived in 1968, publicly introduced in 1972. I talk about it in depth in the book, but here's the short form. It went through 4 waves until finally in the early 90s it began to be used for buying and selling stuff. But then a really big signal happened, a big signal that all of you in this room are too young to remember, but I remember it. It was the Newton, the first tablet-like device, and it was an utter failure. It came in 1993, it went out in 1998, but it failed. It failed in a really interesting way. And it led to the iPhone and the iPad, roughly 2010. That's the threshold. So about 2010, there was this shift from separate tools and a crude internet to a media ecology through this graceful interface of the iPhone and the iPad. And young people who became adults in 2010 or later, they're the only digital natives. So they're now 22 or less. And I thought I'd tell you a little about them. If you became an adult in 2010 or later, you're much more ready for the scramble. And most psychologists say kids become adults between between 13 and 15, depending on the kid and depending on the culture. So that's how I arrive at this number. The 2010 threshold, in 2010, these separate tools started to become a media ecology. And why is it so different? I'll show you in two paired pictures. One of the pieces about my background, my PhD was in sociology, but I had an ongoing interest in religion, and I have a divinity school degree. I never got ordained, but I continue to have an interest in religious phenomenon. And this is one of my favorite pictures. This was taken at the Vatican just before the introduction of the Pope in 2005. Now I'm going to show you a picture taken from the same place, but after the threshold. This is before, this is after. That's the threshold. So if you're a kid growing up with that, you're just different. And the younger you are, the more different you are. So here's what you're like. And all this is based on literature. I'm sharing all this data with you. Some of this is in the book, and I've updated in the 6 months since the book's come out. But here's the summary of what we know now about these young people, 22 or less, the people just entering your companies now. What do you like? Globally, most of us are asset poor. This isn't just about jobs, it's about assets. Roughly half of Americans have zero assets. It's not just about having jobs. This is the rich-poor gap. It's about having assets. Many of us have experienced untreated childhood trauma. There's just new research on longitudinal studies of childhood trauma and how they have lifelong impacts. If you're less than 22, you're more likely to have those. We are seekers. They're seeking meaningful hope. Kids have always thought meaningful hope, but it's never been so hard. We are makers. We are makers. My time is compressed. I want to do things urgently. We have what we're starting to call now spectrum diversity. It's a lot more complicated than categorical diversity, categorizing by race or gender or age. This is spectrum diversity. And that's why I think we have to look at this as a threshold, not just a new generation. This is not a generation. So I don't like the term Gen Z because it's just not a generation. We are curators. Don't call us consumers. We did a project for P&G recently on the future of advertising. And it's pretty obvious now that advertising as we know it is dead. It's just going to take about 10 years to die. And the kids will kill it. Because they're such good curators. They don't want to be called consumers. They want to be engaged. Do I really want a job? The millennials, they expected to change jobs 3 times before they were 30. This young people less than 22, they expect to change jobs 5 times before they're 30. But they had the new question, do I really want a job? And now we've got platforms like Upwork where it's possible to be a programmer or a designer, make $200,000-$300,000 a year, have healthcare insurance, have retirement planning, and according to the US government, you won't have a job. It's the Hollywood model. So one of the big questions for you all during this next decade is, what's the viability of a job? How many traditional jobs will you have? Certainly fewer than you have now. These young people want experiences, and they value experiences more than things. They're hardworking, but they want to know why. Hardworking for the right gig. A lot of adults think they're lazy. I don't think that at all. It's just they want to know why. I am my social network for work and for life. We've got this wonderful mock-up of the future resume. And if you think of the future resume of these young people, a lot of it is their social network, and they bring their social network to work. They're really digital savvy. They're very super connected, but they're also cautious about sharing personal behavior, much more so than the millennials. That's why they prefer Snapchat and they don't like Facebook. Blended reality. They have what Linda Stone calls continuous partial attention. They're able to do multiple things at once and still concentrate, at least some of them. That's really different. We think of it as multitasking. We don't get it, because the more tasks we do, the less well we do them. These kids, I think they're different. They're learners. They want to learn, but they're not sure they want a degree or need a degree, and they don't want student loan debt. They refer to the millennials as generation debt. Generation debt. We just did a new custom forecast for Southern New Hampshire University. Amazing, affordable online university program that went from being a struggling liberal arts college 10 years ago, about to go out of business, to being a thriving, almost $1 billion nonprofit business now with 93,000 students. It's clear we've got to have a different model for learning. Gamers, most of these young people are gamers. They have a gameful mindset, emotionally laden attention. These are the young people who grew up with mass shootings. If you think about the Parkland kids, they pretty much show all these characteristics. And this isn't just California, this is global. It plays out differently in different regions of the world, but this is a global disruption. So, a few implications. We're moving toward a world now where young people will bring gaming experience to work, and it will be a big competitive advantage for us. I'm doing an executive workshop the rest of the day, and we've been diving deep into this. I call it voluntary fear exposure. And my colleague Jake Dunnigan says it really well. He says it's better to be surprised by a simulation than blindsided by reality. And the kids have got that. The kids have got that. So the way you prepare for the scramble is you learn from your kids. If you don't have kids, you find kids. And here's the tone. Here's the tone I want to set up. And this is our best scenario planner, Jamé Cascio, telling the story of this age of gaming using the signal that's called Twitch. And Twitch was purchased, since we did this video just a couple years ago, Twitch was purchased by, who was Twitch purchased by? Amazon, exactly. That's the answer to every question.
Twitch is a video streaming platform, similar to YouTube, where anyone can broadcast themselves playing video games for anybody who wants to watch. Over the last few years, it's grown into a phenomenon that dwarfs television for younger demographics, with the average viewer spending 20 hours a week on the service. Successful Twitch broadcasters enjoy daily audiences of thousands of viewers and can earn up to $8,000 a month from a combination of sponsorships, advertising revenue, and merchandising carrying their personal brands. The rise of Twitch is often attributed to the tremendous growth of competitive esports, where professional video gamers compete in front of global audiences for prestige and impressive cash prizes. But at its heart, Twitch is simply a mechanism that allows people to easily demonstrate their skills to an audience that wants to see them in action. This can be thought of as both entertainment and instruction, especially as the most popular streamers document their personal strategies for completing challenging levels or breaking existing speed records. In October of 2015, Twitch launched the Creative Channel, a new category that encourages digital artists to stream their artistic process in the same way they'd stream a video game. LiveCoding.tv provides a similar service for programmers to share their coding strategies. It's not difficult to imagine how this model might be applied to practically any digital workflow, allowing high-skilled workers to passively broadcast their techniques to budding practitioners. As more of our global work processes are mediated by digital platforms, Twitch has found success precisely where most online education platforms haven't. Where MOOCs and online degree programs have struggled to find traction, Twitch suggests a future where organizations enlist their top performers in sales, design, or engineering to broadcast the nuances of their craft to newer employees, upskilling their workforce without the need for formalized retraining. In 2016, companies like Penguin Publishing and JP Morgan have already started to recognize that four-year degrees don't provide the best representation of a worker's ability or cultural fit.
Okay, you get the idea. What we think of today as video gaming and signals like Twitch, tomorrow, thinking 10 years ahead, this will be the most powerful learning medium in history. The interfaces in today's video games are at least 10 times better than anything we have in offices, even if we use Macs or the Surface. And that's what the kids will expect. They're going to expect that kind of digital interface. So those of you who do learning, those of you who do training, 10 years from now at Convergence, you'll all be gamers. You'll all be gamers. Not necessarily today's video games, but you'll all be gamers. You'll all be doing immersive learning. So young people who became adults after 2010, they're 22 or less in 2018, I call them the makers. That's my favorite term for them. I don't like the term Generation Z. It's just too simplistic. You can't block these kids into a generation. They're different things at different times. It's a threshold. And the younger you are, the stronger the effect. It's a threshold. So why is it so important? Young people who are hopeful will be inspiring. I'm so optimistic about this generation. And yet, young people who are hopeless run the risk of being depressed or dangerous. I study the literature of those young people who join terrorist groups, and the key variable is the lack of hope. The lack of hope. If they're hopeful, they're inspiring. So in a real sense, we're all in the game of hope. We're all in the game of hope. And I'm really optimistic about that game, but we got to see it as a game, and we got to see it as hope. And so many of my social science colleagues are kind of looking at the negatives of the technology, looking at the negatives of video gaming, look at the negatives of the internet. And it's true, there are challenges. But wow, this is a historic cross-generational learning opportunity if we embrace it. That's what I think of as cross-generational mentoring. And your function, you did it with race, you did it with gender, you've done it with ethnicity. Do it with generations. And it isn't just the millennials. The big disruption is those 22 or less. So here's the core forecast, and I can say even in a VUCA world, I'm sure this is going to happen. Anything that can be distributed will be distributed. It's just a force from the future now, a major wave of change that you have no control over. It's going to be there. You can choose to ride it, or you can choose to be hit by it. But it's a wave. It's a wave. And Michelle Dean said it really nicely. She said it, the author Michelle Dean, authority has become something diffuse and flammable, like spray paint. Like spray paint. And to me, the risk in this world is that we lose the ability to govern ourselves, that anything that can be distributed will be distributed in the world of blockchain and distributed authority computing. The risk is we lose the ability to govern in this tribal world. When I now teach the 3-star generals in the Army, there's only 42 of them. I teach them on their first day in Washington 4 times a year, 5 at a time. And I'm followed by Madeleine Albright, the former Secretary of State. And she's got a new book out now called Fascism, A Warning. And I have great respect for her. I think she's got real issues that she's raising. But I'm actually less concerned about that because of this digital technology that is just so inherently oriented towards not just decentralized, but distributed computing. So these are the kind of organizations that human resources can contribute to. They're what I call shape-shifting organizations. They have no center. They're more distributed authority, less centralized. Hierarchies come and go. They grow from the edges where diversity flourishes. I went to the divinity school where Martin Luther King went, and I was there when Dr. King was killed. And when we were there, we were studying diversity and civil rights as a social equity issue, and it certainly is still. But now it's an innovation issue. It's an innovation opportunity. We now have big data analytics that shows us that more diverse teams are also more innovative. They can't be controlled, but they can be guided. And here's the secret. How do you lead in a shape-shifting organization? You be very clear about where you're going, but very flexible how you get there. This is the secret from the special forces. This is the secret from the military. They're no longer command and control, except in the traditional army, not in the special forces. Shape-shifting organizations grow from the edges, and it's at the edges where diversity thrives. And this link between innovation and diversity is very clear now. This is Scott Page's work at University of Michigan. And this is what we call now a shift from categorical diversity to spectrum diversity. And it's a reality, a world where diversity will be more important and much more complex. So here's my reframing of the VUCA world, and I flipped this and I teach this at the War College now and I share it with you. Looking 10 years ahead, volatility yields to vision. Uncertainty yields to understanding, complexity yields to clarity, and ambiguity yields to agility. And you got this. You know about Agile HR. This is Agile HR. This is your chance to do Agile HR. Now, my only advice is don't call it HR. My take as an outsider is that you've got the best name of any function in business. Human resources. But the term HR has been devalued. It's been operationalized. It's been outsourced. It's just a tough term to use and have people take you seriously. But if you say, what function do you work in? And you say, I do human resources. And I recommend saying it with a pause. Human resources. That's the best name of any function. That's where we're going in the future. Human resources, and it's your game to win. Agile human resources. Here's another core forecast, and this is a sure thing. The future will reward clarity, but punish certainty. Clarity is very different from certainty. Clarity is being very clear about direction, but very flexible about execution. Certainty is saying something is, and hierarchical certainty is the most dangerous kind of is. So this is the landscape for future organizations. It's not just one shape-shifting organization. It's a landscape of shape-shifting organizations. And you're in the middle of this. Human resources, you all know how to do this. You know how to weave the net, how to organize the smart mob. And there's good news here. There's more flexibility to scale up and down, more ways to make a living. It's great. If you're ready for freelancing, if you're ready for Upwork, you're golden. On the other hand, the bad news is the criminals are better at shape-shifting organizations than we are. There's fewer traditional jobs inevitably. You can't just bring jobs back to America. The jobs you bring back are going to be different jobs. There's more potential for worker abuse. There's a lower bar for employers, and it's awful if you're not ready for this freelancing economy. So if you have to make a living on Amazon Turk, you're playing in a world that's very close to slave labor. Micro tasks for micro pennies. So what's next? What's next? What can you anticipate? We're past the threshold. The 22-year-olds have joined the workforce. And now we're in what I call wave 6. It's decentralized business matchmaking for value exchange. It's really interesting. This is the period of Uber and Lyft and Airbnb, and it's matchmaking for value exchange. Very cool, and only temporary for what's going to happen next. And what's going to happen next is very disruptive. It's what I call it's the internet for value exchange without central authority. So this is the world of blockchain. And the big deal is distributed authority. So we all know about Uber. And Uber has done things that no company did, but they also created quite a bad reputation for themselves along the way. So there was a spinoff started by a former Uber driver. This is a signal which tells us the direction we're going. Arcade City started in Austin, Texas, and it connects drivers and riders directly. It's effectively eliminated the need for ride-sharing middlemen to exist. They're able to charge their own rates, and what they find so far is passengers pay 20 to 30% more than Uber charges. And the drivers keep all the money, and the network is supported by insurance. So by connecting the riders and drivers on your own platform, ride-sharing has sidestepped city regulations. So here's the founder of Arcade City talking about his vision, but he's challenging Uber. He's challenging traditional companies. What is it? What is it that a human company can provide that an algorithm can't? And here's his answer.
Tell us about what you are. I mean, so that the public understands what Arcade City is and what your service does.
Sure. So Arcade City is a new breed of ride-sharing and other peer-to-peer services company started by former Uber drivers. I'm myself a former Uber driver. And we grew up out of the idea that riders and drivers should be able to connect directly without a middleman. The middleman, Uber in this case, can do all sorts of bad things to that relationship. If Uber decides to pull out of a city overnight, as they did a few days ago in the Philippines and as they did a year ago in Austin, Texas, putting thousands of drivers out of a job overnight and stranding tens of thousands of riders, that shows you that that's probably not the best way to structure this relationship.
So here's the future. And this is the big risky future.
Here's what you're going to see from Arcade City over the next year. We will launch service in many more cities and at a faster pace. To accelerate the growth of this network into other cities, soon we will start paying our drivers and riders with blockchain-based cryptocurrency called arcade tokens. Whenever our users take actions that grow the network, like providing well-reviewed service, recruiting drivers and riders, growing our network of strategic partners, anything that provides measurable value to the Arcade City network, they can earn arcade tokens, which they can either sell immediately for cash or use within the Arcade City ecosystem for services and bonus features. How will we fund all of this? We are not accepting traditional venture capital, where we would need to trade control for money. Instead, we are going directly to the people with a public token sale in 2018.
An ICO, not an IPO, cryptocurrency offering. That's really interesting. Now, will it succeed? Probably not. But if it fails, it's going to fail in a really interesting way. And when we heard this morning about the fourth industrial revolution, to me, the big news out of that is distributed authority computing. And blockchain is the lead indicator, and Arcade City is the lead signal. And the question that it's asking back to you is, what can a human company provide that an algorithm can't? Does your company have a good answer to that? You better. And there are good answers. But you better have a really good one, a growth story answer. So the last signal I want to share with you is this book, which just came out. And it looks at a series of distributed organizational efforts that I think would benefit dramatically from blockchain and from distributed authority computing, called New Power. And as you watch this clip by Jeremy Hyman's, one of the co-authors, Henry Timms is out of New York, by the way, and they both have led a series of really interesting nonprofit organizations, but this is also about for-profit, as you'll see. And as you watch this, ask yourself, as a human resources leader, is your leadership old power, or is it new power, or is it both? And where I stand as a forecaster, in these shape-shifting organizations, we're definitely seeing a shift from old power to new power. Old power will still work in slow-moving, predictable areas, but there just won't be that many of those. The new power will be necessary to thrive. And you see models of this in Silicon Valley and other places, but it hasn't spread yet.
So I want to introduce you to this framework, old power meet new power. And I want to talk to you about what new power is today. New power is the deployment of mass participation and peer coordination. These are the two key elements to create change and shift outcomes. And we see new power all around us. This is Beppe Grillo. He was a populist Italian blogger who, with a minimal political apparatus and only some online tools, won more than 25% of the vote in recent Italian elections. This is Airbnb, which in just a few years has radically disrupted the hotels industry without owning a single square foot of real estate. Now, we're familiar with all of these models. But what's striking is
Can you cut the sound? Okay, so I'm going to narrate the rest of this. I try to do a VUCA world happening during every one of my talks, and they're randomly programmed, so I never know quite when they happen, but thank you for that. So this is the summary of old power to new power. And if you see this, we're moving from currency, thinking from currency to current, like think electrical current, from held by a few to made by many, from downloading to uploading, from commands to shares, from leader-driven to peer-driven, or servant leadership is kind of coming back into fashion in this world, from closed to open. It's really obvious if you think 10 years ahead, we're moving from more closed to more open. It's just going to be a very messy process along the way with lots of intellectual property variations. But this is the summary chart I'd like you to reflect on and meditate on and just say, where do I fit in this world? Are you a voice of new power as human resources? I hope you are. And it doesn't mean everybody has to move there right away. It just means that's very clearly the direction, thinking 10 years ahead. And you got to help the transition. If you can survive and thrive on the left side, more power to you. It's just going to get harder. So how do you get ready for the scramble? These are the 5 leadership literacies I want to share with you. This morning you heard about the skills that we've done, and many of you are receiving the map, and we've got versions of them out on the walls and the outside. That's our effort at Institute for the Future, to model the skills that are needed in the future. I want to talk to people in this room and other people in the C-suite and the CEOs and the leaders of the future organizations. This is what you're going to need. It's going to be more than skills. It's going to be literacies. It's going to be practices. It's going to be disciplines. It's going to be worldview. And the beginning, the core, is looking back from the future, but acting now. It's just too noisy in the present. So if you want to understand the future of digital, do not go to CES. And do not read Wired magazine. Both of those are good for some things, but not for understanding the future. They're too noisy. But if you go 10 years out, it's very clear where we're going digitally. There's things like there's going to be sensors everywhere. They're going to be very cheap. Many of them are going to be connected. Some of them are in our bodies. That's the kind of thing that's obvious 10 years out. Then you got to be a gamer. You've got to do what I call voluntary fear engagement. You've got to learn how to thrive, but you've got to learn how to thrive by practicing in low-risk ways. Too dangerous to go out there and just try things. You've got to try them out in a low-risk way. And the military is, again, ahead of us. The industry that's maybe ahead is healthcare, particularly emergency rooms and crisis response. In aerospace, pilot training is done this way. So there are pockets in business, but generally we're way behind the military. Shape-shifting, you've got to learn how to lead in these organizations where you can't just tell people what to do. Shape-shifting organizations. And I've thought about them in an earlier book in the 90s. I called these fishnet organizations, or they were called network organizations. But I kind of like shape-shifting. I like the magical quality. In Harry Potter at Hogwarts, there's a professor of shape-shifting. And it's a kind of magical element to shape-shifting. That's the kind of organizations we're creating, and you got to lead those. You've got to be the ones that understand them. Agile human resources. You've got to be there when you're not there. You've got to be better than in person, because these organizations are increasingly distributed, increasingly porous. So it's not just leading in person, it's leading when you can't be there. And who's going to teach them? Who's going to teach them? Human resources. It's you. You're the ones who are going to teach them. And finally, you've got to create and sustain positive energy. And I see a lot of that as I walk through the halls. As you walk into a room, you've got to emit positive, credible, believable energy. And the energy has to be physical, has to be mental, and even spiritual, but not necessarily religious, because it's so hard. It's so hard to be grounded in this VUCA world. So these are the future leadership literacies. These are the way to thrive in the scramble. The term I'm starting to use, and I'm going to leave this with you now, is navigating the future. That's the theme of your conference. And your resources here, growing your own potential, it's all about preparing to navigate the future, navigate the VUCA world. Agile human resources, not HR. Cross-generational mentoring, not Gen Z. And it's not just mentoring with the seniors, the elders, mentoring. I mean, we do. If you're more than 22, you've got license to play the wisdom game. But you got to game it. You got to game it. And it's got to be cross-generational. And if you're lucky enough to have kids 22 or less, you've got this historic learning opportunity. So the final word I'll leave you with is generativity, and the ability to have faith in the future. And the faith in the future is going to come from this next generation. So we've always had to trust our kids. I love that you're leading all these sessions with kids telling us about the future and telling us about their beliefs. We truly do have to learn from the kids during this period, and it's a historic time. So this is the most frightening forecast I've ever done, and it is the most hopeful, and it's because of the kids. Thank you very much.